This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X business card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase. Capital One, what's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. You may have already heard, but the U.S. gained 59 new residents last month, who all arrived on a plane from South Africa.
We've essentially extended citizenship to those people to escape from violence and come here.
And even more came this past weekend. They're all white Afrikaners.
Afrikaners are a white minority group here in South Africa.
For those who don't know what that means, here's South African journalist Kate Bartlett.
Basically, they're the descendants of European colonists, mainly Dutch colonists. Afrikaners were the architects of the system of apartheid segregation, racial segregation in South Africa, okay, by which black and white people lived under different rules.
Apartheid. It ended 30 years ago in the early 90s, and South Africa is trying to rectify what's still a seriously unequal society.
Everybody lives together in this multiracial society, and most people just get on with it. But there's a small fringe group, I would say, of Afrikaners who never really got with apartheid ending. These people are a very small but vocal group, and they've been going to Capitol Hill for years.
And they caught the attention of Donald Trump. Fast forward to now, Trump has given some white Afrikaners refugee status because of a quote-unquote white genocide happening against them in South Africa.
It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about. White farmers are being brutally killed and their land is being confiscated.
But per her reporting on the ground, Kate would argue
nobody is pushing for genocide of white people in South Africa.
So what's actually happening in South Africa? And what in the world does it have to do with our current government? Well, I asked Sean Jacobs. He was born and raised in South Africa and is now a professor of international affairs at the New School. He says that South Africa's attempts at rectifying apartheid are a DEI boogeyman the Trump administration can use to their benefit.
This sort of idea is like, right now on the right, DEI, diversity, inclusivity, etc. This is all bad. And by the way, if you go down that path, you're going to end up like South Africa.
If a country was DEI, it would be South Africa.
To talk more about how we got here and the parallels between our nations, I sat down with Sean.
Thank you for having me.
And Kate, who you heard earlier.
Thank you.
There's a lot to be said about language here, and the U.S. government is also at this moment revoking temporary protected status for thousands of Afghan refugees, some of whom assisted our military in operations in their country and would be in deep trouble if they returned. I also want to say genocide itself is a pretty loaded term, especially right now. It's one that's been used by some over the last couple of years to describe what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International organizations both allege Israel is committing acts of genocide, though both the Biden and Trump administrations have rejected using that term for describing the effects of Israel's military campaign there, as has Israel. It's also important to note genocide is a legal term, and the international courts have yet to rule definitively on whether Israel is committing one or not. But South Africa has formally alleged at the International Court of Justice that Israel is guilty of violating the Convention Against Genocide in Gaza. Again, Israel has denied the charge. And now President Trump has started referring to what's happening in South Africa as white genocide. What does it mean that both of these terms, genocide and refugee, are being applied to a historically privileged group and denied in other cases?
It's race. For white nationalists, white South Africans are white. I think Palestinians are not considered or thought of as white. Mm-hmm. What did you have at the White House is you have some decontextualized images being played on a loop or whatever. You have printouts, random pieces of paper being held up. This, according to the American government, these are the standard of evidence of a so-called genocide, when in fact there is an international court, the ICJ. In that court, it was said, that Israel is acting in a manner that could be genocidal. That for me is probably a scandal of where we are now in the world, when you can make these loose, unsubstantiated claims, and it then gets taken seriously by the American government.
Okay, let's talk about how the idea of a quote-unquote white genocide even got popularized. Kate, I know you said there were Afrikaner lobbying groups in Washington trying to get the president's attention. I think we also have to note Trump's own close relationship with a specific white South African, Elon Musk, who was a young person coming of age during apartheid. And yet he has said in 2023 on X that South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was unresponsive to those that Elon Musk felt were, quote, openly pushing for genocide of white people in South Africa. So this is a word that he has used, and he's somebody who's not just very rich, but also very connected and close to President Donald Trump. It seems like it's a term that's been floating around for quite some time, and we're seeing it land in a very specific way now. But what's really going on?
There's high crime levels across the board. Sure, it's a problem, and the country doesn't deny it. But by far, the biggest victims of crime in South Africa are Black people, are poor Black people in the urban areas, young Black men. So I think that is why a lot of people are looking at the Afrikaner flight and just going, what? White people in South Africa are, on the whole, still an extremely privileged group compared to the rest of the country. I think what Musk retweets a lot and what Trump played in the Oval Office when Ramaphosa visited is videos of politicians singing this song, Kill the Boer, which is a struggle era song that means during the fight against apartheid, this was a song that was sung, and it means kill the farmer or kill the Afrikaner. It depends how you translate the word Boer, either farmer or Afrikaans person. But, it has its place in history as a struggle song. And so people still sing it sometimes at events, but it's not really calling for the murder of white farmers. And I think people take it too seriously and they amplify it. And the more they write about this, the better it is for the people singing it. Like the one politician that Trump played in the White House, Julius Malema.
Yes, from what I understand, he's kind of a controversial figure who founded a leftist political party, but he's not a member of the government.
Yeah. Since Trump played him on the White House walls, nobody's more delighted than this politician, Julius Malema. But this is a song that, the Constitutional Court here said has historic value. And it's not meant to be taken literally. Nobody's calling for mass genocide.
You rightly point out 3 courts all ruled that it's a struggle song, not literally about killing whites.
Right.
I speak Afrikaans. Boere meant police when I grew up. It was a kind of associated with white supremacy. And secondly, I think it's a distraction because it's not government policy to sing that song. It's not the policy of the ruling party. And Julius Malema is not a member of government. Now, there's a separate debate, of course. Should we keep singing Kill the Boer? Does it actually contribute anything? Unfortunately, reactionary groups, parts of the media is trying to make this the issue.
I want to talk about another aspect of this that I don't think we've gotten into yet. This is also about land. Why is one of the base reasons for this specific situation that we find ourselves in, where Afrikaners are being brought to the United States as refugees? Why is this more about land and less about murder?
Okay, so white South Africans are about 7% of the population. That's not just Afrikaners, that's descendants of British colonists like I am. 7% of the country, white people, still own 70% of the land. And of course, this harks back to apartheid, where Black people had their land taken, people were moved, they were resettled, often brutal resettlement programs where entire communities were removed because you had white areas and Black areas, and the government chose where people could live, where Black people could reside. Since the end of apartheid, the government has been saying, we need land redistribution. Something needs to be done to change this inequality. And a lot of Black people in this country think they haven't moved fast enough. So what caught Trump's eye, I think, is that earlier this year, the government passed a bill in Parliament, and the clause that was particularly controversial is this line that in some rare circumstances, there can be land expropriation without compensation. And this panics a lot of white people in South Africa because they look at neighboring Zimbabwe, where in the early 2000s, the Mugabe government did start this whole land reform process, which became quite bloody and violent.
Right. Similar to South Africa, white settlers in Zimbabwe violently removed Black people from their lands in the colonial era. But in the 2000s, after a slower Zimbabwean land redistribution program tried to rectify that, things got chaotic and armed citizens and officials alike just started invading farms.
Exactly. But what the South African government says, and the experts and the lawyers, is that South Africa is not Zimbabwe, that this clause will be used in very rare circumstances if land is left lying fallow, for instance. But the thing to remember is that this passed in January. So far, not one farm, not one piece of land has been seized from a white farmer. Not one. There's no white genocide.
Everybody in South Africa knows that there is no government policy to willfully target a population based on their identity. The richest person in South Africa who went along with Ramaphosa to the White House is an Afrikaner.
You know, also even thinking about this from another angle, I also saw that AfriForum, a lobbying group for Afrikaners, is also seemingly not pleased with this refugee situation. The chief executive of AfriForum, Callie Creel, said Afrikaners can't survive in the U.S. as a cultural community and that he'll stay in South Africa.
I just wanted to say about the AfriForum. They've come in for some criticism in South Africa, okay, because they're one of the groups that has been going to Capitol Hill and lobbying representatives in the US. And then when Trump did introduce this executive order, they kind of held a press conference and seemed a bit shocked and said, well, thanks very much for listening to us for all these years, but actually we don't really want to go there.
Right.
You know, in South Africa, you can send your children to an Afrikaans school. And there's Afrikaans TV shows. There's Afrikaans news. And if Afrikaans people want to opt out entirely, they can. There is a Afrikaans whites-only enclave in South Africa called Orania, which basically you can only live in this town if you're white. The government lets them be.
Coming up, why is the Trump administration getting involved in South Africa's business at all?
If a country was DEI, it would be South Africa.
Stick around.
This message comes from Charles Schwab. When it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices, like full-service wealth management and advice when you need it. You can also invest on your own and trade on Thinkorswim. Visit schwab.com to learn more. This message comes from LinkedIn Ads. Target your buyers by job title, company, role, and skills with LinkedIn Ads. All the professionals you need to reach in one place. Get a $100 credit on your next campaign at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Learning. IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid no matter the age or personality. Get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from NPR sponsor HP. Easily search through personal files, gain valuable insights, and make smarter, more informed business decisions. Unlock the future of work today with the HP AI PC. With the right tools, work doesn't have to feel like work. To learn more, go to hp.com/AI PC.
Why would Donald Trump be interested in protecting, let's say, white Afrikaners by offering them refugee status in the United States specifically? Like, why get involved there with that in this specific way?
I think there's a long history in which South Africa, I think there's two things. One is South Africa is like a red rag for the right.
When you say red rag, what does that mean?
Like it's like to a bull, you know, like when you in the...
Oh, you just did the hand wave, like red rag, meaning like a matador's red cloth, like that aggravates the bull. I'm with you, okay.
So basically, South Africa was seen as this kind of bulwark against communism. So blacks were supported by the Soviet Union. So in that Cold War rhetoric, black South Africa was on the side of the Russians, and white South Africa was on the side of the Americans or the West. Now, but beyond that, among conservatives, among the right, there was an affinity with white South Africa in the way they shared certain kind of anxieties around political rights, civil rights for black people. Chester Crocker said when Reagan came into power in 1980, he said, President Reagan knows that he's on the sides of the whites.
Right. Crocker was Reagan's Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs.
Since the end of apartheid, and I would say more recently, now I'm just sort of to jump forward to Trumpism, if you create this idea of a besieged white population in the US, you have a similar kind of discourse in South Africa. I would argue that in the US, this sort of idea is like, right now on the right, DEI, diversity, inclusivity, etc. This is all bad. And by the way, if you go down that path, you're going to end up like South Africa. This is part of the discourse to make that connection.
If a country was DEI, it would be South Africa.
There's so many kind of connecting threads between the racial caste system that exists in the United States and has existed in the United States, and also the racial caste system that exists in South Africa. And this specific issue, I don't know, to me, it seems kind of like President Trump is using a domestic issue in a foreign country to fit the narrative of, perhaps what he wants to be talking about in the United States. And we can see from how his administration has interfaced with civil rights laws that he seems very interested in talking about protecting the civil rights of white people. So I'm curious what you all make of this use of South Africa's politics framed by a specifically American concern. What do you think about that?
For me, I think a lot of this has nothing to do with South Africa and South Africans.
Yeah, and we just hope here in South Africa that it doesn't set race relations back, because there's been a lot of progress in the last 30 years.
I think at some level, maybe this will lead to a national debate around sort of white anxiety about post-apartheid South Africa and belonging and your commitment to the national, whatever the national, I mean, that's a very South African word, the national project.
That's a very American term as well.
Whatever that project is, hopefully this leads to a frank conversation about the obsession, spending all our times with the anxieties of white South Africans. It's actually a scandal that South Africa is so unequal and that we endlessly have to talk about the comfort or whether or not whites are having it okay. I mean, when I go back to South Africa and visit relatives in black townships, colored townships, or friends in African townships, I see this. Who gets discriminated against? It's a scandal that there hasn't been more change in South Africa on the front for poor black people, and that we're spending so much energy on the anxiety of whites.
Well, Sean, Kate, thank you both so much for this conversation. It was really enlightening.
Thanks, Brittany.
Thanks for having me.
That was journalist Kate Bartlett and Sean Jacobs, professor of international affairs at the New School. And I'm going to put on my influencer hat for a second and ask you to please subscribe to this show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening. Click follow so you know the latest in culture while it's still hot. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Liam McBain.
This episode was edited by
Nina Patak.
Engineering support came from
Zoe Vangenhoven.
Our supervising producer is
Barton Girdwood.
Our executive producer is
Verilyn Williams.
Our VP of programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luce. Talk soon.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR. This message comes from Jackson. Seek clarity in retirement planning at Jackson.com. Jackson is short for Jackson Financial, Inc., Jackson National Life Insurance Company, Lansing, Michigan, and Jackson National Life Insurance Company of New York, Purchase, New York.
This message comes from Homes.com. When you're shopping for a home, you want to know as much about the area around it as possible. Homes.com has got you covered with a comprehensive neighborhood guide from local experts. Homes.com. We've done your homework.